Good afternoon, class. My name is Specialist Shilla. The brief today is public speaking, servant leadership. This is BLC class number 011-21, and this brief is unclassified. So the purpose of this brief is to give factual evidence of the effectiveness of servant leadership historically and in the present. So the agenda for today's brief, the main topics and points that we will be discussing are: what does the Army define as servant leadership? Characteristics of servant leaders versus toxic leaders. Historical examples of servant leaders. Statistics about servant leadership. How This Is My Squad integrates servant leadership into the Army. And a conclusive summary of everything at the end. So what does the Army define as servant leadership? According to the Army University Press, the difference between triumph and defeat may come down to something intangible: leadership. A particular style of leadership in which the leader serves others and places their needs first in a humble approach to meeting collective goals is known as servant leadership. So, Army values and servant leadership. The main point to get across here is that in the Army values, selfless service is one of the main Army values. Selfless service also happens to be one of the main characteristics defined in servant leadership. So the Army values on the Army.mil page says, we put the welfare of the nation, the Army, your unit, and other soldiers before your own. This selfless service ties back into servant leadership once again. And this shows that one of the characteristics of servant leadership is in fact in the Army values. So down here we can see loyalty, duty, respect, selfless service, honor, integrity, and personal courage are all of the Army values that we hold. So in this slide we're going to be going over servant leadership characteristics as opposed to toxic leadership characteristics. So on the left side is servant leader characteristics, and the right is toxic leader characteristics. So the first one is active listening. Active listening in everyone that you encounter in the Army is crucial to be a good servant leader. Actively listening to what they have to say, whether it's a problem or a suggestion to make things better, is crucial to being a servant leader. This goes for NCOs, soldiers, officers, and all forms of Army leadership at every echelon. Active listening is an important key in servant leadership. Empathy. Empathy is relating to a soldier's problem, or any service member's problem at that. Being able to relate shows the service member that you care and value them as a member of your team. Empathy is key to being a servant leader. Healing. When we talk about healing with servant leadership, healing is the ability to remedy things and make things better for your team whenever a problem arises. The effects of healing are crucial to make your team more cohesive and trusting of their leaders. Healing is another characteristic of servant leadership. Awareness. Being aware of what your team brings up in regards to problems, being aware of your team's life events such as marriages and such, regarding your team is crucial to be a servant leader, because you have to be aware of what your team is doing, what they need, and how their life is going. This also builds cohesiveness and is a key characteristic in servant leadership. Persuasion. The ability to persuade your team members and teammates to do a task to accomplish the mission is key. Instead of using force and authority, persuasion can be a key tool to showing your teammates why we are accomplishing that task in order to accomplish the big picture, the end goal of the mission. Conceptualization. Conceptualization is another characteristic of servant leadership, and conceptualization is key in seeing the big picture of a mission. Foresight runs along the same lines as conceptualization, but is being able to predict things that will happen, whether they're positive or negative. Stewardship is taking ownership of your role as a leader. Commitment to the growth of people is pretty self-explanatory, and building community. These are all from Spear's Institute of Servant Leadership. On the other hand, toxic leadership traits are arrogance, irritableness, lack of confidence, incompetence, unrealistic expectations for your team, being discriminatory, taking credit for others' actions, and selfishness, caring about self-image rather than development of the team. These are all traits that you do not want to have in our toxic leadership. So why servant leadership works historically in context. So an example of conceptualization, which is a characteristic of servant leadership, is when Command Sergeant Major David Davenport was the former Sergeant Major of the U.S. Army Training and Doctrine Command. His team demonstrated conceptualization while generating the NCO 2020 strategy. This played a pivotal role in the Army when him and his team visualized the bigger picture and created a plan to improve the development of the NCO Corps, which has a lasting effect on the NCO Corps today. This conceptualization, an example of servant leadership, will go down in history as to why servant leadership is effective. So here's a quick statistic about servant leadership. A study by the Leadership Quarterly in an academic journal says that they found in a study in 2019, using a sample of 1,485 staff nurses and 105 nurse managers at 9 different hospitals. They demonstrated that servant leadership is directly related to more nursing help and creative behavior, and it is related to patient satisfaction through nurse job satisfaction. So the nurses were able to create better patient satisfaction because they themselves were more satisfied at their job, facilitated by those servant leaders, nurse managers. And on the left side of the screen, you can see the structuring model with an increase in servant leadership structure. You also saw an increase in nurse satisfaction at the job, as well as patient satisfaction. So moving on, how servant leadership is integrated into TIMS, or This Is My Squad. This Is My Squad was pretty recently developed and implemented in the Army, and stewardship is a key characteristic that's directly tied into This Is My Squad. Stewardship is also a key characteristic of servant leadership. Stewardship is defined as taking responsibility, and the key word ownership, of supervising a team or organization. In an interview with Sergeant Major of the Army, Grinston, on YouTube, on the YouTube show SMA Talks, Episode 6, Sergeant Major of the Army Grinston said, "It is about ownership," when referencing TIMS. "If I walk up to my home, I want it to look clean and neat. If it's my daughter, or if it's my soldier, I'm committed to that. Or if a soldier says, 'That's my sergeant,' that's what it means. It's not top to bottom, it's bottom to top. Is where we have that ownership, where they are mission focused." And once again, this is from SMA Talks, Episode 6, about This Is My Squad. So that's a key example of how stewardship and taking ownership of your team and supervisory role is how the Army is also integrating this new program and servant leadership into our Army today. So, a brief summary of everything that we just covered in this presentation. We covered what does the Army define as servant leadership. We covered key characteristics of servant leaders versus what not to do, and the characteristics of toxic leaders. We used historical examples of servant leaders to show how servant leadership has proven to be effective. We have showed statistics about servant leadership and how servant leadership is effective through statistical numbers. We also showed how the Army is integrating This Is My Squad, a program that adopts servant leadership in the Army today. At this time, this concludes the brief. Are there any questions? No questions? All right, once again, my name is Specialist Shilla, and this was a brief, unclassified brief about servant leadership in the Army. Thank you for coming out, and I hope you learned something today.